Welcome to the Fat Tony's podcast, where we bridge the gap between everyday life and expert insight. Join us in conversation with real-world experts, gaining practical advice and strategies to navigate the complexities of the modern world.
Welcome, everyone, to another edition of the Fat Tony's podcast, where today we will be exploring the intersection of finance and science. I'm your host, Seb Lees. Today we have an absolute pleasure of speaking with Emanuel Derman, a renowned physicist and quant. Emanuel was a pioneer in the early quant space, having worked at Salomon Brothers and Goldman Sachs, where he was later appointed managing director. He's the author of several books, which I'm sure many of our listeners will be familiar with: My Life as a Quant, Models Behaving Badly, and most recently, his newest book, which I have in my hands now, Brief Hours and Weeks, My Life as a Capetonian. He's also currently professor at Columbia University, where he's director of the program in financial engineering. There's so many accolades for Emanuel that it would take me an hour to list them all out. So I think I'll leave it there and just say, Emanuel Derman, welcome to Fat Tony's. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
So I suppose the first question I want to ask you, and this is the same question I asked another recent guest, Rafael Duardi, who was another early quant pioneer. At the time, you were part of this first wave of PhDs, physics to really go into Wall Street. Traditionally at that time, my understanding was trading was seen as much more of an intuitive, instinctual thing. What was the reception like to kind of, on Wall Street, to guys from quant backgrounds, physics backgrounds, PhD backgrounds coming in? And do you have any interesting anecdotes from that time?
Yeah, I spent a fair amount of my time in writing Models Behaving Badly to talk about that. I mean, I came there, I think maybe earlier than Raphael, I'm not sure, in late 1985. Excuse me, I'm a little hoarse today. They knew they needed quant people. I went to fixed income quantitative strategies. They knew they needed quantitative people, and at the same time, in a kind of nice way, they treated them as geeks. So they were, people sort of treated you relatively well, but at the same time, I have a lot of jokes from that time. My co-worker, Raj Khani, and I got into the elevator, and people said, "Are you all allowed to get into the elevator at the same time?" If we walked, at one point, we walked between two traders who were talking, and they sort of grabbed their heads and said, "Oh my God, like I can't stand the force field." It was complimentary and it was sort of insulting at the same time. But net, I didn't pay much attention to it. I'd spent 5 years I'd started out as a physicist, which I liked. Then I spent 5 years at Bell Labs, where I learned an incredible amount of useful software engineering, but didn't feel very, very happy from organizational point of view. And so I was very happy at age 40 to be in a quantitative strategies group, and I didn't mind any of the so-called prejudice.
So would you treat it as a little bit of a curiosity at first? Because today, when you look at the finance world, when you look at the quant world, it's all geeks, right? Software engineers, very highly quantitatively skilled guys. Do you think at the time when you arrived, the writing was on the wall and they realized this was the future, or was it more of a kind of, this is a curiosity?
No, it was a curiosity. First of all, very few quant people dreamed of being traders. They were, I want to say, happy to be helping write models that traders would use. I used to think of myself as a theoretical guy working with the experimentalists, to use an analogy from physics or some other scientific field. That and even in the early 1990s, when I had switched, I'd gone to Salomon for a year and then come back to Goldman. I went to Goldman in 85. I worked there 3 years. I went to Salomon for a year, and then I came back to Goldman equity derivatives, and I was in charge of quantitative strategies there. And really, being a quant was not a compliment. The reason I called my book My Life as a Quant, I've repeated this many times, although not in the book, was because I'd taken my kids to see a Swedish movie called My Life as a Dog. And that rung a bell in the back of my head. And that's why I chose that title. It's not that people didn't treat you okay and they paid you okay by my standards. But being a quant, there's a guy, Mark Rubenstein, who wrote, I think I have on my bookshelf back there, a book called A Dictionary of Quantitative Finance. And in there he has quant, a quantitative strategist, often pejorative. This is like the early 1990s. People, managing directors didn't have computers. They had desks that were just conference tables. It was kind of infradig. I don't know how many American listeners are going to know what infradig means. It was infradig to have a computer, and people, guys that worked in my group who were mostly foreign, I have to say, were they didn't want to put PhD on their business card because that was like a sort of brand of Cain. That all changed later. I think with the rise of D.E. Shaw and Renaissance and even D.E. Shaw losing tons of money during, I don't know if D.E. Shaw lost money during LTCM, but during the whole LTCM crash when you could see quant destruction as well as quant creation. I think quants, in a perverse way, got a lot of respect at that point.
It's absolutely fascinating when you talk about it from this point of view, because for me coming up, quant was a badge of honor and something rigorous and something quite difficult to attain. And it almost developed this kind of rock star status within an organization. So it's absolutely incredible because you're talking about the early 90s. I'm talking about the 2010s. It's not that big a time span to have this complete 180 in the perception of these guys. And it's just incredible.
True, though. Traders were much more innumerate then. It was rare that you found traders had a legal background, had an MBA background, had a law school background. You didn't find a lot of PhD traders in those days, or masters in a scientific degree traders. It all changed, I would say, in the early 2000s, it started to change.
You mentioned, I think you mentioned in My Life as a Quant that one of the initial factors for this influx of PhDs into finance was the kind of collapse of the academic work bubble in the 70s, going from the Cold War era when huge amounts of money was pumped into research, and all of a sudden a lot of that funding dried up, which drove PhDs into finance and other industries. What's interesting, I'm a software engineer, and what we're seeing now, we've seen huge layoffs in tech, and we're hearing all the time now commentary on AI is going to make a lot of software engineers redundant, or at least make existing software engineers so much more productive that they won't need the levels of employment. Do you think AI could have a kind of a second wave of this kind of thing where we start to see the software technical quants who have gone in now being driven out into another field?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I'm not a big expert on, I read up in a popular sort of way about what's happening with DeepSeek and all the latest stuff, but I'm not really a good judge of that. But yeah, I think that's a possibility. At the beginning, a couple of years ago, when ChatGPT came out, everybody said nobody was ever going to program again. I'm a little skeptical of that.
Yeah.
It could have that effect. I'm skeptical of AI discovering new things, but that may be wishful thinking.
I have mixed views on AI. I'm not an expert either. I just follow the commentary, and I've heard the proclamation that software engineers are dead so many times now. Before AI, you had visual coding and things like that. So I'm a little bit skeptical as well. I do think it's going to have an impact. People think I'm derogatory when I say this, and I don't mean it in a derogatory way. But I consider AI to be a little bit like the implementation of the spreadsheet. So if it can enable existing workers to be 2 to 3% more productive, and it acts as a kind of underlying infrastructure tool, that's amazing because that has hundreds of billions of dollars in efficiency costs when you scale it across the economy. So I say that in a positive way, but I certainly don't feel like it's going to be this earth-shattering paradigm that people are talking about. I'm getting kind of .com vibes slightly from some commentators on this. So we'll see. Time will tell. Time will tell.
Yeah, I'm on your side. I forget what his last name is now, Gary. I got an email from him this morning. I won't look. He's a cognitive scientist who writes regular blogs on AI and books on AI and keeps them tooting the fact that they're vastly over especially the ChatGPT guys are vastly overselling what they have. I mean, the energy they use and the amount of money they use is kind of astonishing. So I also get .com vibes, pets.com.
We'll see. We as you know, it's very difficult to predict the future. The first time I used ChatGPT, it felt like a magic trick to me. In that the first time you see it, it feels groundbreaking. And this is incredible. But the more times you see the trick repeated, the more the curtain is lifted a little bit, and you start to notice some of the inconsistencies and problems and flaws with it. So again, I'm waxing lyrical here, but time will tell.
Yeah, it's funny what you said about a magic trick, because maybe I've changed my mind a little bit. I'm sort of impressed about what it does with apocryphally, what it does with x-rays and CAT scans and stuff like that. But the first time I saw it just over 2 years ago, I tweeted, I'm going to just regard this as a parlor trick for now.
It's a good analogy. And that's certainly what it feels like, because it's a black box. And unless you go to a really low level of detail and step through, it's very hard to grasp. And what's interesting, all the software developers I know are now clamoring to AI. And there's this public perception that software development is highly mathematical. And it's not at all, really. Unless you're doing something highly specialized, it's not terribly mathematical. And they're realizing, I think a lot of software developers, that to do AI properly, it is mathematical. It's a fundamental different game. And there's a very big difference between that. So moving on, you mentioned Bell Labs. And what I find fascinating about you is you're a little bit like, have you seen that movie Forrest Gump?
A long time ago. You might have to refresh me.
So it's his life story, his biography, and he intersects by accident or by design.
In every picture in the past.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
He crosses paths with all of these influential people. And you're a little bit like that, I think, because, when you look at the people you've come across, when you read your books, you've got Bell Labs, which, as a software geek, the genesis of what came out of Bell Labs is incredible. You were the first wave of quants or early quant, and you interacted with so many influential people in that space as well. You were at Oxford doing some postgraduate research when you came across a young Stephen Wolfram, I think you mentioned briefly in your, and also I think you mentioned as well, coming across, I forget his name now, the author of Gödel, Escher, Back, which is
Douglas Hofstadter, yeah.
That's the guy. So you have all these wonderful connections.
Yeah, more like, some of them are connections and some of them are just collisions. I mean, I know Doug Hofstadter, but he's not really a friend of mine. Steve Wolfram I see occasionally when he visits Columbia. Bell Labs, I was in a sidebar of people doing business research. I wish I'd been in the real pure research area, but I wasn't.
Mm-hmm. I still think it's impressive. I think you're doing yourself a slight disservice there.
I think in physics, for a while, I knew a lot of. I mean, I was in physics I came to Columbia. God helped me in 1966, and I got a PhD after a long. I don't want to say struggle. That's the wrong word. After a long trip in 1973, and then I was a postdoc and an assistant professor until 1980. And there, I certainly was doing research in the vicinity of all kinds of people who I still know, although I don't see, like Mike Green, who is at Oxford now, I think, or at Cambridge maybe, who invented string theory, who I remember was struggling with it at the time. We all used to go to summer schools together, but they're very distinguished people.
I think you mentioned, I think there's an analogy, I believe it's in My Life as a Quant, but correct me if I'm wrong, where you talk about in physics, you can be very good at it, but you can meet people who are so vastly above your sphere. And then I think you mentioned your wife who's in biology, and she says it's different in biology. You can meet people at the top of their game, but they're not as far removed, whereas in physics can be just so intimidating.
Yeah, and I can't really speak for biology from personal experience, but certainly in physics, you can meet people whose work you can maybe understand, but you realize there's no way on earth you could ever have come up with anything like that.
I think there's a famous quote where you're talking about in physics, there may one day be a theory of everything. In finance and social science, you're lucky if there's a usable theory of anything.
Yeah, that's my quote.
Why do you think finance kind of adopted this veneer of hard science rigor? Is it how much of it is a genuine approach, and how much of it is kind of wanting to project an image of stability? I think of it in the past, banks architecturally would imitate classical Greek and Roman architecture to give this impression of stability. Your money sits with it. Do you think the imitation of physics is a 21st century version of that?
Yeah, hopping back for a second, I agree with what you said about banks. I mean, in my lifetime, in the 70s or in the 60s, guys working poor, I don't mean financially poor, but poor security guards working in banks in the late 60s and early 70s would, God help them, give their life to save the money when bank robbers or the Symbionese Liberation Army came in, Paddy Hearst, to rob them. And now, when banks look like convenience stores, nobody's going to give their life to save the money in a cash machine. Good for them. Yeah, about finance, how it got so mathematical, I don't know. I used to like to say that the efficacy of finance is inversely proportional to the amount of rigor that they use.
Yeah.
Compared to physics. If you read physics papers, I don't anymore, but if you read classic physics papers from the 70s and 60s that created the standard model, it reads like applied math. If you've done applied math, it doesn't look that different. Paul Wilmot is a big fan of that approach, and I am too. And if you read finance or economics papers, they look like axiomatic mathematics, and I don't understand how they got to that point of view. It's a kind of cultural respectability that they have to write like that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what to make of it, except I don't like it.
I love your observation on the security guard being willing to give his life, and maybe the architecture might have something to do with that, of being in an institution. That's a very behavioral science take. I think Rory Sutherland, the behavioral science guy, would absolutely love that observation.
Yeah.
Do you think physics? I am at risk of sounding derogatory here, and I really, really don't mean it. But do you think financial papers or any financial paper or model has the same level of rigor as a physics paper or model, if the equivalent, or do you think it's an invalid comparison?
Well, no, rigor, yes, but efficacy, I think not. In that, when I came, I think I write about all this. I'm repeating myself, but when I came to work at Goldman, and I was sort of working, I was going to say almost apprentice, but working with Fisher Black at the beginning. And when we worked on Black Derman Toy, I had this illusion based on my just a year or two earlier life in physics, well, actually 5 years earlier before Bell Labs, that what we were building was a unified theory of financial or fixed income modeling. And he was much more pragmatic. He just thought there were different models suitable for different areas, even within fixed income. There might be one model for swaps and one model for mortgages, and that they didn't all necessarily have to be consistent. And I came around to that view myself, after a couple of years, that really you were trying to build some half plausible model that you could calibrate to that particular sector of the market and try to use it to extrapolate to nearby sectors, or go from liquid securities to liquid securities that you calibrated to illiquid securities that you were trying to price but value. but I didn't think there was some global theory that explained the way people behaved, and the way people behave. Yeah, Rory Sutherland, the way people behave keeps changing anyway. It's not an invariant the way the laws of physics seem to be. So yeah, I think the rigor is the same in a mathematical sense, but the I like to say the syntax is the same, but the semantics isn't the same.
Right.
The math may look similar, but what you're trying to do is different. In physics, you're often trying to find a theory that accurately describes the way some part of the universe behaves, and in finance, you're trying to build an analogy that you can extrapolate for a short region to try to figure out what illiquid things should be worth based on what liquid things are worth.
I think as well, you're right. You're always going to have, with any human system or any non-physical system, you're always going to have that element of a complex system and complex system dynamics in there, which is you're never going to get that almost platonic ideal that you get in physics models.
Yeah.
And I think as well, some of that may be lost. And obviously, I know you're a big advocate of this, of course, but the danger is in mistaking the model from reality or the map from the territory. And we see that, we saw that in 2007. Personally, I think we might be beginning to see that at the moment. We've got a huge speculative asset bubble, not just houses, but everything. Markets seem, I'm in a slight state of disbelief at the levels markets are at, but I don't know, it's irrational. I have no idea where we're going with this, but it feels to me like we're in the midst of a bubble. And what worries me this time is it feels like an everything bubble rather than just, a housing bubble or an asset bubble. And, it's like Trump, that Trump crypto coin that was released a couple of weeks ago. And it was, pointless. And it was like $17 billion market cap overnight. It's just absolutely astounding to me. So I don't know where we're going with it, but.
Yeah, that lies outside the range of all models. That's just, I don't know what you call that, sort of somewhere between Ponzi and political support.
I don't know. I feel like we're in the twilight zone sometimes, to be honest.
Yeah.
That is where we are.
No, I agree with you about maybe everything bubble. And also, people write a lot about the polycrisis, meaning, the whole world going crazy.
Yeah.
But I have a bee in my bonnet about what you're saying about finance and physics. I sort of have which not all physicists agree with me, but I have a sort of bee in my bonnet about the difference. I tweet about it sometimes between models and theories. And I feel like models are analogies where you say, I'm going to talk about physics. So I can understand the nucleus by pretending for a little while that it's like a liquid drop of water that vibrates and oscillates and spins. And I know in my heart that it's not a liquid drop of water, but that's not a bad analogy. And I call that a model, meaning it's modeling it on something else. Whereas something like Newton's laws or Maxwell's equations or the Schrödinger equation, even if they're not right, I call those theories. And I think physicists think of them as theories too. They give them the name theory, not model, meaning they're attempts. And I say attempts because they don't have to be 100% right, but they're attempts to describe some part of the universe really accurately. Mm-hmm. And they may not be right. But for example, I'm talking physics, but if you learned Maxwell's equations, it's impossible to think about light without thinking that it behaves according to Maxwell's equations. And there's no gap between the theory and the event in your head. They're two sides of the same coin. Anyway, and there are a lot of physicists I used to argue with them. I once gave a talk at Santa Fe and they beat me up. And they would say that what I call a theory is really for them just another model. But I think they use those words, but they don't behave that way. When they're looking for the right theory, they don't feel like they're looking for a model. They feel like they're looking for some kind of truth, and they behave that way. And it's interesting, Maxwell, I'm rambling a bit, but I once looked all this up, and Maxwell, he wrote down his theory of electromagnetic interactions in 1865, which wrote down Maxwell's equations. But in 1863, he tried to build a version of electromagnetic waves based on a I don't know what you call it, currents of water in currents in water. And he wrote that he was building a model to try to build up his intuition. And he had a clear distinction in his head between a model and a theory. When he finally wrote his final paper, he called it a theory of the electromagnetic interaction. His earlier paper, he called a model. Anyway, as I said, I have a bee in my bonnet about the distinction between those two. Only models, even Black Scholes is a model based on an analogy with smoke diffusing or Brownian motion or something like that. It's not really true. Okay, I'm not going to say more about that.
No, this is utterly fascinating to me. You're right. As a software engineer, I can relate to that, because when you're writing software these days, especially, you're really talking about what level of abstraction are you operating at. And when you're writing objects and classes, that has very little direct bearing relation to what's actually happening several layers of abstraction down once it's compiled and then transferred into machine code and executed. But we use these mental models to help us through life. And even in school, I mean, we're taught, right, a British education, you're taught, but the model of the atom that you're taught at high school is not the actual, you get to university, it's like, what you learn is actually not quite true, but it's a level of abstraction appropriate until you reach the next one. And I think there's a human tendency in any field to search for truth. I think we're hardwired, whether it's religious truth or scientific truth or personal truth, we're kind of hardwired to be on a quest for that. So maybe it speaks to something deep within us.
I can tell you a funny story, if you like. When you said hardwired, it reminds me of the late Mark Rubenstein. I don't know if you know who he is, the guy who invented the binomial model. And unfortunately, he died a few years ago. Very nice guy. And he once said to me that he thought he was hardwired to find the truth. And I once had dinner with him maybe 10 years ago at his house in I forget where, just north of San Francisco.
Sausalito, maybe?
Yeah, maybe Sausalito. Very good. And when I drove, and I had rented a car at the airport, I was there for a few days. I gave a talk at the FE. But anyway, I went to his place, and we had a long discussion about, kind of a sophomoric discussion about free will and being hardwired. And he insisted there was no free will. And then when I left, I had a rented car, which I didn't really know. And it was a convertible. I was trying to be, they had upgraded me, and I thought, let me have fun. And I backed out in the dark, and I hit one of his little new trees, and the exhaust cut it off. And he was very upset. And then I said to him, we're all hardwired and there's no free will. I'm sorry, but I'm not really responsible for this.
I love it. I'm going to use that one in future. I think I'm stealing it.
But I think people don't really believe what they say as what they say. Yeah.
I am fascinated by the art of what I call mental gymnastics, and people being able to. It just absolutely. I won't go into it, but I could talk at length about. But I digress. What I'd like to move on to now is to talk about your new book, Brief Hours and Weeks: My Life as a Capetonian. Could you remind me? I know you sent me a copy. Could you remind me of when this is being released? When this is coming out?
March 1st, in I don't know, 3 weeks or something like that.
Okay. Guys, you heard it first. Go and order a copy. I think you can order an advance copy now on Amazon.
The Amazon, I don't know, the Amazon, there are a lot of problems with the publisher, and the Amazon US, Amazon.com one looks fine, and the Amazon.UK one can order it, but the hardback looks as though it was released on October 14th last year, and the title is slightly messed up, and I've had no success in getting them to fix it, but it's still orderable.
Well, hopefully we'll iron it out. I will say thank you very much for sending me a copy. I absolutely loved this book. I want to talk about why I loved it in a moment, but I suppose the very, very obvious first question that you're going to get asked a lot is why your memoirs in Cape Town, in South Africa, as a child in your adolescence. It's such a departure from your previous books about finance and your life in finance. What kind of prompted you to write this?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I want to brag in some way and say that that it's not really such a departure in that I was looking at trying to write blurbs to advertise this book because nobody else will do it. And I had one from Paul Samuelson, who a friend of mine knew, and I sent him, actually, he wouldn't read email. This was like 20 years ago, but I sent him a manuscript, and he wrote back a blurb that's saying something like, Emanuel Derman's story reads like a novel, but it tells you a lot about how people use brains to make money, on Wall Street. And I want to say I like the idea of writing something novelistic in a way. And I didn't kind of know where to do that. I'm not really good at making up things totally out of my head. So partly I wanted to write something that had a story. Yeah, a lot of mixed reasons. It started out as a Substack, and its title was My Life as an African, which I don't know how that sounds in England, but in the UK, now that Trump's here, it may not be forbidden, but it was totally forbidden as the title of a book. Every time I tried to have it as a title of a book, people told me I'm not entitled to call myself an African because I'm white, even though I'm an African. And eventually I kind of gave up and said, okay, I don't want to offend anybody. And I struggled with many titles, and I came up with The Brief Hours and Lives is okay. It's from a Shakespearean sonnet. That My Life as a Capetonian was sort of a weak attempt to link it to what it's really about. I don't know. It's a lost world. I wanted to write about that lost world. B, I wanted to write something that had a little bit of a story. C, I'm sort of horrified that I got up and left Cape Town because I was kind of a protected child. And if I'd known what I was in for, I wouldn't have gone, I think. I'm glad that I did. But if I'd known what I was in for 50 years ago, I wouldn't have picked myself up and gone. So I wanted to write a little bit about that about how I came to inflict pain and suffering on myself for a while.
It really is a wonderful book, and I'm not just saying that.
I'm glad you like it.
It's very evocative, and it definitely has that feeling of a yearning or a sense for a recently lost past and a kind of certain time and place that does not exist anymore. My favorite thing about it, it's a very ensemble book. It's very character driven. And the way you write these characters is so wonderfully evocative. And I was wondering to myself, is this your writing style, byproduct of your writing, or was it due to your upbringing in a very close-knit community, very close-knit immigrant community, that you had all these wonderful larger-than-life characters around you? Because I don't feel like everybody has that.
I don't know. I do have, God help me, at least for the distant past, I have a very good, wow, look at that. I'm talking to an English person and I said past instead of past. I always say past. As soon as I go back to South Africa, which I don't do very often, I immediately start saying laugh and past again. I have a very good memory for the past. I don't know why. Things leave a strong impression on me. I haven't read a lot of books, but the books I've read always leave a deep. The ones I have read and finished leave a deep impression on me. And I wanted to write, as I said, how I came to do this thing that felt contrary to my nature. B, I really wanted to capture that lost world. I was part of an immigrant Polish Jewish community. My elder sister, who was 12 years older than me, who isn't alive anymore, she was actually born in Poland, She came to South Africa as a 2-year-old. So, I'm Jewish, obviously. American Jews don't have this sense of instability that we all had as Jews in South Africa, as Jewish people, because they've been here 2 or 3 or 4 generations, and they can't picture that being in that middle ground. And I think it's gone now, but I wanted to sort of capture that. And then I had read these books by Nabokov, the Speak Memory, and by Stefan Zweig, called The World of Yesterday, that are all about their particular childhood environment. And I wanted to do something like that. And lastly, I'm giving you all my influences. I had read 3 books multiple times by J.M. Coetzee, who now lives in Australia, a South African writer, and they novelized versions of his childhood, and they influenced me a lot.
I really loved it. I certainly don't, in the British education, we don't learn a lot about South Africa. And what we do learn is obviously overshadowed by apartheid. And if you've got a very limited amount of time in a curriculum, you learn that and move on. So this was a really wonderful insight into a world, but I don't think there's that much source material out there. And I found it interesting. Obviously, you went into an academic career originally, and in your book, you talk about your mum kind of encouraging an academic career as being more respectable, as the kind of height of respectability. Do you think that influenced you to go down that path?
Yes, definitely. I mean, my parents, I don't really know my parents' lives in Poland, but I think they were sort of, I don't know what to say. When I write about it in the book, when I look at pictures of them in Poland, they're dressed like Central European or Eastern European in tuxedos and ties and smoking with cigarette holders and going to parties and looking, even in a town of 40,000 where they came from, not you know what a shtetl is? I don't know.
Yeah.
So not shtetl Jews, not like Fiddler on the Roof. They look like regular, I don't know what to call it, capitalist city people.
Yeah.
And then the way I knew them in South Africa, yeah, they were too, but much more struggling to make a living. And my father was successful in the end, but through a lot of struggle and a much harder life. And my father liked business, although he was very smart. My mother was always encouraging everybody to not be in business. Yeah.
It's interesting you say that, because my next thought on this was going to be, you talk about your father, who's much more like entrepreneurial. And obviously in your mid-career, you sort of transfer from academia to finance, market capitalism. And I think it's wonderful, because it's almost like you've got both of your parents' influences there. You're sort of channeling your mother and your father throughout your career.
Yeah, I wish it were. Yes, I wish it were truer. My father really was entrepreneurial in a small business way. He started lots of businesses. He when I knew him when I was young, he as I wrote in my book, he had a garage, and my mother at the beginning actually helped him pump gas in the garage. Eventually, not, and then eventually he became a property developer and did really well. But he was entrepreneurial in a small business, invisible hand kind of way.
Yeah.
I'm afraid I was never like that, and neither really were my sisters. I think my father would have been proud if he'd been alive when I went to work at Goldman. but I was always like doing this abstract stuff, which in a way he approved of, but in a way, yeah, it was kind of a struggle being a postdoc. I don't know what your history is, but it was struggle being a postdoc. As I wrote in my book, my father always said, and mother always, I don't know which of them, maybe both said, if you've got a career, you can, and you're Jewish and you're sort of a wandering Jew, given what happened in the Second World War, you can go anywhere you like with a career. And in fact, I was kind of the other way around. I had to go wherever the hell there was a job, because there were so few postdoc jobs. And he saw me struggle in a way, and I wish he'd been alive when I was more stable and successful in a business way.
I think you're right with the academia. I've never worked in academia, but I certainly have friends and colleagues, and it is nomadic to an extent, especially now, where you just have to go where the jobs are to a certain extent.
Yeah.
So I want to ask a slightly personal question now. Towards the end of the book, you get to the point where you come to America at the end. And what's interesting is I went back and started rereading My Life as a Quant, because I hadn't read it for a few years. And it's almost seamless. Like, you could read them back to back and get the throughput. It's like a prequel, and it finishes immediately where My Life as a Quant starts. And you talk about the sense of loneliness in quite an open way that you experienced on arriving in America, and trying to convey, I think, maybe to younger people, just how big the gulf was in those days. There were no, there was no email. Even phone calls you had to arrange in advance and cost a fortune. And I think you talk about recording on cassette tapes messages and posting them home.
Yeah. Look here.
Oh, wow. You have them.
I've found them in the basement in the summer from my mother who had ALS, motor neuron disease in England.
Wow.
And couldn't write, and at some point, and sent back and forth tapes, and I was starting to listen to them. I found about 12 of them in the summer, and I listened to 2 or 3, and I didn't want to listen to anymore. There's nothing bad on them, but it was very odd. And you know what's very odd? Have we got time?
Yeah, absolutely.
You know what's very odd is the voices are odd. When you haven't heard somebody's voice for 40 years, images stick in your memory very accurately, and voices, they sound really strange. Maybe I'm going to start listening to them again. They're only 3 or 4 minutes long, but there was something a little bit, I don't want to say painful, a little bit strange. I didn't want to listen to any more of them, but I've still got them sitting here for 3 months. And my niece who lives in Cape Town, her father is on one of these tapes, also sending me a message. And he died very young at age 50. So she was 18 and she's like 55 now, And she was not horrified. She was shocked to hear his voice. She didn't find it recognizable. And there's something strange. Images, one has a much better memory for images than one does for voices, I discovered.
I've heard a theory, I don't know how credible it is, but a lot of our memories, we're constantly remembering our memories and refreshing them. So there's a drift over time from the original source material. And
that's interesting.
And you're right. I mean, I don't feel that old, but I was born in the 80s and grew up in an era where there was very little media or, recording. I've got some photographs, but it's not like today where from a very young age, you're constantly recording your entire life, on the supercomputer in your pocket.
Yeah.
I have relatively little stuff from my childhood. And when I see them now, because my memory of it is just my memory rather than looking at source material, it does feel strange. Even from the late 80s, it feels strange. So I can totally identify with that. And I can't imagine how it must feel after 40 years.
Yeah.
Source material.
Yeah, people now have continuous video of everything.
Oh, I don't like it. I'm so glad I graduated just before Facebook came in and just before camera phones became normal. And I'm so glad it wasn't there at university. And because in my memory, it was this gilded, idyllic time. And I think if I looked at source material now, I'd be like, oh God, it was horrible. I lived in, squalid conditions and yada, yada, yada. So I like the fact that it's a gilded cage in my mind, I think, and I wouldn't want to see it if it was available.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't regret that. You're kind of inspiring me. Maybe tonight I will start listening to just 1 or 2 more tapes again.
It would be fascinating to talk to you further if you do. Not on a recorded podcast, but I'd just be curious to hear your thoughts on it. I love the characters in your book. Obviously, you have your immediate family. I think my favorite side character is, I've got this written down, Dr. Harry Berylowitz.
Oh, Berylowitz. Yeah. He was an amazing man. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little about him for the benefit of the listeners? Because I found him fascinating.
Yes, he was a general practitioner. He looked after me. My right thumb is a little, not really, but a little bit funny because I played cricket for our school, and when I was 10, and we didn't wear gloves in those days or helmets or anything like that. And our school didn't have that kind of equipment anyway. And I got hit on my thumb by a cricket ball. And I batted a couple more strokes, and then I went out. And he came in the night and poked a hole in my thumb to let the blood out, He was a GP. He had a slight accent, unlike my parents, who had a very heavy East European English accent. He had a slight accent. I think he'd come to South Africa as a fairly young young man, maybe 14, 15, from Lithuania. And then he'd worked for a while. I didn't know all of this at the time. And then he'd gone to Edinburgh he'd gone to college somehow and gone to Edinburgh and got a medical degree and came back. And he was like a wonderful man. He was a doctor in the way that they aren't now. He had these fingers that poked into your stomach and into your belly and felt everything. And when I had my appendix out when I was 10, he was the anesthetist. And he was kind of somebody you could confide in. I was saying in my book that he said to me, he's dead. I think his children are in Australia somewhere, like all the South Africans who've left. He said that when he was he once told me before I left that when he was in Edinburgh, he suddenly realized, he didn't use these words, but that if you don't use it, you lose it. And so he became a sexual virtuoso. He was like 80 years old, and he told me this. I didn't quite know what to make of that. I'm repeating it now because he's dead. He was a terrific. He was like a real family doctor, but he was also very skilled. When I Googled him afterwards, I found somewhere when I was writing the book, I found some obituary written by other doctors, and he didn't have an advanced degree in medicine, but he had brought anesthetics to Cape Town at a very early stage, and somebody quotes him as then saying to him, I'm trying to remember the words, they're saying to him something like challenging him as to whether he could do anesthetics, and he said, I don't have a certificate, but I'm an expert.
If I remember it correctly, the quote is, no, I'm not a specialist, I'm an expert.
Oh, that's right. I'm not a specialist, I'm an expert.
It's a wonderful quote.
You've got a better memory than me. Yeah, and I don't remember it from the book. Several people who've read the book always comment on him. There are no doctors like him anymore.
He's another one of these many components in this book are just things that do not exist anymore. And it's this, I think it wonderfully comes together. And it surprised me how British it seemed in part.
Oh, yes.
I felt like there was a lot you wrote about that I could compare to my childhood in the 80s in the Midlands of England. There really was brand names, certain things you're referring to. I think you talk about Blackpool at one point, which I had no idea people outside of the UK were even remotely aware of. And just hundreds of little references. And it was just really interesting.
We were Commonwealth until 1961, you know. So although American pop music and stuff had a big influence, we were British Commonwealth, you know, in the cinema, not in the movies. In the cinema, they used to play God Save the Queen at the end of the movie, and nobody called it a movie at the end of the film. And they would play God Save the Queen and the South African Die Stem, which was the Afrikaner national anthem at that point. Yeah, everything Britain, before your time. Tommy Steele. I don't know if you know who Tommy Steele is.
The name rings a bell, but I don't know if I can.
He was a pre-Beatles, pre-rock and roll sort of pop singer. Bill Haley and the Comets, they were British, I think.
I definitely have heard of those guys before.
And I think Tommy Steele was around the same time.
Well, it certainly felt evocative to me. I want to shift out. I'm conscious of time. I think we've got about 5 or 10 minutes left.
Okay.
I want to talk briefly about cults.
Oh, okay.
So there's a bit in your book where you talk about, I think you say when you were 15 or 16 years old, you started having Afrikaans lessons after school. And you talk about the teacher having this weird device on the side, and it's an e-meter, and she was a Scientologist, which really surprised me because I had no idea that they were Scientology was so widely spread so far back. She must have been one of the very early adopters.
Probably.
And then you go on to say that, I think you entitle the chapter Cults or About Cults or something like that. And you go on to talk about your involvement, and forgive my pronunciation here, but the Shomrim, which was a youth organization you were involved in. I mean, you talk about it like it's a cult. To be honest, it all seems very idyllic and the way you talk about it seems quite inoffensive. Is it tongue-in-cheek, or was there a more sinister side to it?
I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek. I mean, you know, I have very mixed feelings about belonging to that. I'm Jewish. My parents lost more than half their family in the Holocaust. I'm God help me. I think Israel's a good place for Jews to have, all other questions putting aside for a moment. Sure. About the Middle East. And Shomrim was a branch of Habonim, which was the global. Shomrim was an age group within Habonim. It was like, I don't know what it is in Boy Scouts. It's like the oldest group in Boy Scouts. So I sort of approve of it. And at the same time, in the early 60s, it got really culty. Mm-hmm. You know, they put a lot of pressure on you. The part that finally drove me out was when I was going to leave South Africa anyway, was they wanted you to sign a register committing you to go and live in Israel, maybe in a kibbutz, but certainly in Israel, in order to continue being in, it was called in the movement. And I'm still friendly with people from there. And at the same time, so that pressure that they put on me and other people to commit or get out made me feel, in retrospect, like I was in a cult. And I sort of deeply resented, and at the same time, it's left that being part of that organization has left a big mark on me. I think I have a quote over there from The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, which says, Muriel Spark, it's a book and a movie. And the teacher says, give me a girl at an impressionable age and she's mine for life. I feel like I'm like that. They got me at an impressionable age, and much as I dislike certain things, I'm part of them.
Very honest answer. Reading it didn't feel particularly sinister to me. It felt like it was doing a lot of good. It felt, a lot of camaraderie. You talk about doing work at the local orphanage and things like that, and having a group down there.
It's all true. Yeah. It's all true. I don't regret any of it, but there was a brief period. They're not like that now, I think, but there was a period when they were determined to squeeze you into a certain slot or force you out. And I happened to coincide with that period at age 18, and I felt manipulated. I don't regret it, but yeah, there was. But it was weird, On the other hand, if you look at it, 21-year-olds wearing leather woggles and long khaki socks and doing a lot of those things, there was something odd about it,
It's interesting. I wonder if you'd have told yourself at that age, 20 years later, you'll be working at a Wall Street investment bank.
Oh, God. Yeah. Well, one of my sort of, call it Schadenfreude, is that a lot of the people who went and lived on kibbutz, which was a noble cause they wanted to be socialist, they wanted to work in a socialist environment, but in Israel, and many of them left 20 years later, all the kibbutzim became businesses.
Yeah, I get it. I have a couple of friends actually, who grew up in kibbutzes, and they live in England now, but I won't go into it on this podcast, but absolutely fascinating conversations with them about their childhood. So I suppose I've got time for one more question, if I can squeeze it in.
Sure.
There's a bit in your book which I found interesting, which is, I suppose, bringing it full circle, and it's about your decision to study abroad. And obviously, you did your undergraduate, but there's this bit you talk about where there was this feeling at the time that, yeah, you could do a PhD in physics in Cape Town, but the real physics, quote unquote, is done, at MIT or at Oxford or here or there. And if you really wanted to get on the bleeding edge of it, you just had to go there. It wasn't going to be a thing that could be done locally. Do you think that's still the case today with technology and people being able to learn whatever they want? Do you think there's still a need for certain concentrations, whether it's academic or technical or, philosophical? Or do you think you can study anywhere now?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I think much more so you can study anywhere now. I mean, when I was a postdoc in England, to get the latest in the late 1970s, to get the latest articles, there were preprints. You know what preprints are? Papers before they were published, but written as manuscripts that were mailed out to everybody. And you needed to have them to be on the cutting edge, so to speak. Not so to speak, to be on the cutting edge. And you had to get them by sea mail from Stanford. Now they're just on archive. There's absolutely no problem. So I think it's much easier, and you could probably be in Cape Town and still be part of some group that's doing research at CERN, part of a 150-person group, probably.
Absolutely.
in experiments. So I think it's much less so. And maybe it wasn't even so dramatically so then. But if you wanted to do particle physics, you couldn't do that in Cape Town.
No, that makes sense. And you're right. You do see visiting lecturers now, visiting professors that never actually been to the university, or, they're just fully remote. And I think there's a human aspect, though, of being in a certain community. I can imagine it's amplified in academia, perhaps more so than other fields. There's that aspect of being part of a physical community.
But I think at the time we all almost had the feeling that if you wanted to do nuclear physics, you could do it in Cape Town, low energy nuclear physics. If you wanted to do high energy particle physics or theory, you pretty much had to go somewhere else.
Do you ever daydream about where you would be now if you hadn't left?
Oh, God, I sometimes wonder about it. No, I can't figure it out. I don't know what would have happened to me on a personal level or a professional level.
Well, I think that's a really good place to end this. And I think we have about 2 minutes left anyway. I just want to say a sincere thank you. On a personal note, your first book, My Life as a Quant, had a profound bread and butter impact on my life and encouraged me to go into finance. I think out of all the books I've read, what actually had the most pragmatic bread and butter impact in the direction of my life was probably My Life as a Quant, because it just gave me the confidence to switch careers in my 30s in a similar way that you did. So a sincere thank you. And I still find it surreal that I'm able to talk to you right now. The absolutely wonderful conversation. I suppose before we wrap it up, we've got obviously Brief Hours and Weeks, My Life as a Capetonian, March 1st. It's a truly, truly wonderful book. Order 2 copies, one for yourself and one for a friend. Is there anything else you want to mention or talk about or plug before we call it a day?
No, thanks for showing my book. No, one thing you just said triggered something in me, and that is that when I grew up, it seemed like you would have to do one career for the rest of your life. And I think the world's much more fluid now in what feels like a good way. You don't have to feel like if you started out being an accountant, you have to be an accountant for the next 50 years, or if you started being a physicist. And it's kind of nice that people can have these sequential careers. You kind of mentioned that, and it happened to me, and it was like astonishing, but I'm happy for it.
Yeah, I like it. I like the fact that life can have acts and chapters throughout your career. I think it's wonderful, and I'm so glad that it's possible these days.
Thanks very much for reading my book and asking me so many related questions.
No, thank you for coming, and thank you for answering them. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Me too. Thank you.